Hello and welcome to part one of the Voting Rights Podcast. Question is, should every African American vote? My name is Walter Burford. I'm an international tax attorney and a person who is passionate about equal opportunity. I would also like to introduce my colleagues, Karen Howard and Merlin Bass, and they will introduce themselves a little further.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Karen Howard. I am an attorney, but I'm also a policy advocate in early childhood and healthcare equity. And I firmly believe in voting. I don't think I've ever missed a year. So thank you. Merlin?
Hi, my name is Merlin Bass. I'm a tax attorney based in New York. Strong interest in helping to change America for the benefit of Blacks and a strong advocate of voting.
Very good. Voting in this country has been extremely contentious throughout the history of the United States of America. While African Americans have not been the only ones to fight for the right to vote in this country, we do appear to have received the greatest resistance. Our African American ancestors have been beaten and killed while actively seeking the right to vote. And yet, not all African Americans currently exercise their voting rights. These non-voting African Americans are frequently criticized by voting African Americans for shirking their responsibility and indeed their obligation to vote. Is this criticism well-founded? Should every African American vote? If so, why? In the next 30 minutes, we will attempt to consider this very issue, providing some insight into whether every African American should vote. And with that, we will get started. And what I'd like to do is ask Karen and Merlin to give some kind of initial response to this question. Karen, should every African American vote?
Absolutely. But I'm not the one who criticizes African Americans who do not vote. I encourage them to vote. So I was just on the Hill visiting members of Congress because Congress, the House, Republicans have zeroed out funding for a program that combats infant mortality, maternal mortality. And as we know, there are high rates of infant mortality. Black babies die at the rate of 2 or 3, sometimes 4 times as likely than white babies. And we suffer from a high instance of Black maternal mortality. And so they've zeroed out a program specifically to address those 2 factors. And I was talking to a congressman who said elections have consequences, and this is why we vote, right? We vote so that our voice can be heard. And throughout millennia, right, and throughout thousands of years, Blacks have been denied the right to vote. And I think because the vote and the franchise is just that powerful when we all do it, when we do it in unison, and we exercise our political power and right. And I'll turn it over to Merlin.
Yeah, so my view is a little more practical. There are elections where every Black person should vote. There are others where, I'm okay with you taking an election off. If the consequences of not voting are extremely concerning, as in the last presidential election and the next one, I think every African American should absolutely vote. In some of the local elections where you feel like the candidates will all support your positions and your interests will be protected, advanced, no matter which one wins, then you can take an election off here or there. But at the end of the day, you're voting to make sure governmental resources are being used for your benefit. Now, some people will say, well, does my vote really count? It may not, but you shouldn't leave it to others to determine whether or not your interest is pursued.
So I want to think about that for a minute and just say, Merlin and Walter, it's not just the act of voting, right? Because I worked as a staffer in Congress. It is the act of holding your representative accountable, right, after you have voted for him or her. It's picking up the phone and making sure funding. If you don't have childcare, if you don't have healthcare, it's making sure that they hear from you. Because I think too often we think of voting as one and done, did that, check. When really it is there's much more than to a representative society of holding them accountable and voting them out and making sure they know. I'll remember. Like I used to have like constituents say, I'll remember this. And they did, and so I wanted to add that.
But that's kind of an interesting question, because how do if I must vote, then how do I ensure that my vote translates into something meaningful? And I understand your point, Karen, that you're saying, hey, there's some work involved and there's some accountability involved and there's some follow-up involved. And it sounds very complicated to me, that there's a lot that has to be done. So I can't just go in the ballot box and vote. I have to go and vote, and then there's some follow-up I have to do and some other things. And it sounds to me like maybe the organizations I have to be part of. There's, the parties I have to be connected with. And so it doesn't just become a matter of voting. It doesn't just become a matter of, okay, when Super Tuesday, whatever comes around and it says, you're voting for the president, then, hey, I cast my ballot that day for everybody on the ticket and I'm done. It sounds like there's something more that I would have to do to ensure that my vote kind of really gets in a meaningful way counted. And I don't know, Merlin, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I would say that, and let's take the last presidential or the prior presidential election, the 2020 presidential election to count. And there, the choice was Trump or Clinton. So if everybody, just all of the Black Americans voted for Clinton, that was enough, right? They would have stopped Trump from being elected. And I think the country would be in a much better shape for Black Americans. Now, in order to get change in many elections, just voting is not going to be enough. And even if we all vote, we may not get everything we want. Voting is the first step. And there's, we make up maybe 14% of the population. So we shouldn't expect that if we all vote for one candidate, that candidate is going to do everything we want. But as Karen mentioned, once you vote for a candidate, then it's on you and others to make sure that candidate delivers on what he promised or get rid of him or whatever.
So that does raise that point. That does raise the point of the 14%. And Karen, I will direct this to you. I mean, with 14% of the population, if all African Americans vote, and let's assume that number is accurate, it may be a little bit in 1 or 2%, but let's say it's 14%. If every African American voted and you get the full 14%, what does that get us, Karen?
Well, the last election, it got us Biden elected and Kamala Harris as vice president.
Okay.
So, a lot of times elections are won by the margins and by just a small margin, right? And so thinking that, well, we're just 14%, we can't rule. I think that's the wrong way to think about it, because we can tip elections. I also think I'm a really big proponent of coalition sort of politics, where folks with like interest. I need to be concerned about immigration. You can say, well, that's not really a concern for Black Americans. It is actually for Blacks. But coalition politics means I support immigration reform, even though that might not be my issue, in exchange for others supporting other things like healthcare, access to childcare. And so I think it's really important, as we're looking at voting and blocks and voting through the institutions that we belong to, our churches, our fraternities, our labor unions and others, to really be on board with those causes along the spectrum that we support, so that we can have more leverage in elections. Hope that makes sense.
And so it sounds like in part what you're saying is, and you said that even if we only have 14%, in some instances we're tipping the scale. And so that's a meaningful 14%. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, because if we've seen, when we sit it out, bad things happen, right? And when we vote and tip the scale, like we did in the last election, at least we stave off worse things from happening, and some good things happen.
Is there, and Merlin, I'll ask this question of you, is there a benefit in just the perception, if even just the perception that African Americans are a strong voting bloc? And when I say that, I mean kind of there are two things that come up to mind. One is we can discuss that African Americans are not monolithic, right? They don't just have one voice and think one thing about all things. They don't think the same way about all things. But at the same time, there may be certain things that they do come together on, and they say, "Hey, this is really important." You both had mentioned the presidency, right? So there was some consistency. I mean, probably I would definitely in the when the Obama years, Obama, you know, when he ran for president, but also when you talk about when Hillary ran for president. So what do we think about that? Is there some benefit to just the perception that we are a voting bloc versus the perception that they don't come to the polls every time?
Yeah, certainly, because you know, if the candidate knows that we as a group could get them over that threshold, then they're going to have to try to appeal to us so that we will support him or her. Now, what happens in some cases is that the other candidate is so bad that they kind of feel like, well, maybe, you know, we don't have to reach out to you as much as because you don't have a better choice. But you know, I'm of the opinion that, you know, if we consistently come out as a group, then we can try to leverage that perception and that power to demand certain issues be addressed.
Okay, and Merlin, just come back. Well, actually, Karen, to come to you on one point that Merlin had raised earlier on is, do you think it's okay if we are, you know, we vote sometimes, but not all the time?
So I personally vote all the time, down even to the local elections. You know, your county commissioner, the judges in your district, your state representatives, your city council. Those are the folks that are so close to you that it's so easy to call their office. They live right in the community. You might see them in the grocery store. I just think it's really important to exercise your right on those local elections because that impacts so much of our lives. And so I understand, though, having lived in Washington, D.C., where folks said, well, you could vote, you know, there are local elections that you care about. But Washington, D.C. will overwhelmingly vote Democratic, and you could probably sit this one out, and the result's not going to be, it's not going to register. Um, I don't buy that. I like to vote myself, but I understand it. So I think we should always vote.
And that raises that's a pretty good segue into the next question that I had. The next question I have is, you know, the statement has been made that all politics are local. If I'm saying that properly, I might be off a little bit, but essentially all politics are local. So why do they say that, and how does that impact, you know, our discussion here today? What, you know, we always, most of us think of the presidential election and you know, electing president, electing senators, all the federal things. That's what we look at as being what we should be focused on. But then you hear a statement like all politics are local, and it says, well, hold on. You know, do we really take those seriously? Those of us who are not kind of entrenched in voting, those of us who may just come out and vote, you know, when we hear of the presidential the presidential candidates and whatnot, and the elections, the presidential election. So this concept of all politics are local, and to me, it sounds like there's more work to be done to get to know those judges, to get to know the folks who are on the ballot, because we're not, most times you don't get as much television
That's exactly right.
access to these folks. So it's a little more digging has to be done. So I guess the question is, what is there to this all politics are local, and what is there, and how do you actually go about getting some meaningful access to these folks and holding them accountable afterwards. I know that's a lot, but I will leave that open-ended to either one of you who wants to address it.
Well, I'm going to just
Maybe
jump in
both of you.
because I want to hear what Merlin has to say, but I heard the phrase first when I was working on the Hill. And when your member is in cycle, which means they are up for election, you do everything you possibly can on constituent service. If you need a passport, call your member in cycle, right? If you need anything done, if you need a recommendation to one of the universities, call your member who's in cycle. And that's where I heard the phrase, all politics are local. Because if you address the needs of the constituents at the local level, and where they are, whether they're asking you and you're a national politician or local, that means they're going to vote for you. And so I took that to mean when they call, answer, because that's a vote at election time, right? When they call for something, that's another nod for holding your members accountable. At the end of the day, on any given day or week in Congress, they would tally up the number of calls that they got on different issues. And if those calls reached a tipping point where you could say, wow, there's a number of people calling, what they think is behind those calls are hundreds of other people who think that way, but didn't get a chance to pick up the phone and call. I better pay attention to what this is. I better do some canvassing back in the state on this issue to make sure that I'm on the right side of the issue with my constituents. That's what I think of when I think of all politics are local. And that's why accountability is so important, because they're actually watching. Merlin, what do you think that means?
Yeah, so for me, it's, I would say all politics start locally. So the politicians that can impact your day-to-day life the most are probably closer to you. Your mayor, your councilman versus the president. The president can address larger issues, but if your street lights are out, if there's you don't have funding for your school, if you want to deal with a problem in your neighborhood, that's usually going to be most effectively addressed by the local politicians. And similar to the in-cycle concept, when elections are around, those local politicians are easier to find, right? They're coming around, they're looking for your support. When once they're in office, it may be a little more difficult to track them down. But I think, the focus is that we should definitely participate locally, because that's going to impact our everyday life. The larger issues, that's usually going to be addressed at the state governor level or the congressman presidential level or the national level. So those officials and elect president and the senators and their representatives, they're elected locally as well. So if they're not doing what they should for their local districts, then it's going to be harder for them to get elected. So they have to both protect and take care of the local communities at the same time as addressing some of the national or statewide or countrywide issues.
Yeah.
And so if so I think I understand. I think that's telling me what both you guys are saying is that this all politics are local. I need to reach out and understand who's who, and to whatever extent that I want to get things done in my community or just around me in my state or what have you, then being able to know who these folks are, reaching out to them and helping to put them in office as collectively with other folks and coalitions maybe is going to be extremely helpful. And that makes sense to me. But now the other side of this becomes, I said at the outset that voting and voting rights has been very contentious over, the last couple hundred years at least, right? So, when you look at where African Americans are still, there's a Voting Rights Act, after having the right to vote in the Constitution, after you have a 15th Amendment, right? Um, you still had to have all these Jim Crow laws and other things were put in place to kind of say, let's take away this right to vote. Women didn't get the right to vote till 1920. Native Americans had a difficult time getting the right to vote. So, with all this contentiousness about the right to vote, it sounds like there's something to this right to vote. And you guys have been talking about, what there is to this right to vote. But now the question becomes, well, with these things and the gerrymandering and things like that are taking place where they're redefining districts, voting districts, so that certain groups can have a better chance of getting their folks into office. Is there still a chance for me to get my vote in, that to make my vote count, even with all of these things coming against the effectiveness of my vote? And I leave that's to either one of you or both.
Yeah, so an interesting way to think about that is why are they making it so hard for you to vote? Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly, it's going to be an ongoing battle. We're basically trying to determine policy and how resources are going to be applied, right? So the majority would prefer to be able to dictate what policies are going to be enacted and where the resources are going to go. And, if we sit back and don't participate, don't vote locally, nationally, statewide, then we have less of a say in how those resources are allocated and what the policies are. So as much as they try to prevent and make it harder for us to vote, that's something we should always do. And for me, if you just step back and say, if you look at the actual act of voting, it's maybe a couple of hours on one day every year or a couple of years. So when you look at the amount of effort that it takes to vote, it's not that great of an ask. Now, to vote properly and do the work to make sure you're supporting the right candidates, that takes a little more work. But we're not asking people to commit 2 hours of time a month to vote. It's usually a 1 day, not even a full day thing. And if we do it right, we can continue to make progress. If we sit out, then we're going to have rights taken away.
Merlin, you mentioned something really important. The question you'd ask, Walter, is can you skip some elections? And the reason why there's been gerrymandering, which which actually configures the congressional districts and the state districts in the way that they are, is through state legislatures. And so had we been voting consistently in those states, right, to combat what they were doing, because in a lot of ways, Republicans and Democrats do this. Republicans, I think, do it more, but they took the long game and have been doing it over 20 years to form these districts so that they appear what you see today, and they minimize Black vote, brown vote. And so it's really a plea to pay attention to state elections. They're just as important as national elections, because we could have stopped them from doing that. And we didn't, or weren't able to. And I second what Merlin said. The right to vote is powerful. They wouldn't be doing this. You said this, they wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't powerful. And I think we have an obligation even more now to go out and vote. We have an obligation to fight against gerrymandering. And there was just a case in Alabama in which the Supreme Court said Alabama had to redraw their state map and their electoral lines. They appealed, they remanded the case or sent it back to the state court to do what they said. The state court did the exact same thing and sent it back up to the Supreme Court. And the question was the Supreme Court going to allow this refusal to obey their edict? They did not. They sent it right back to them and said it wasn't acceptable. And so I think we have to use everything at our arsenal, whether it is the judiciary, whether it's going to court, whether it's voting, whether it's activism, to make sure that we have the right to vote and keep the right to vote, and we have to exercise the right to vote.
Yeah, that's good. That makes a lot of sense to me. One thing, and I know both of you have stressed that in different ways, that asking a certain amount of time, Merlin, when you say, hey, it's only a certain amount of time to cast that ballot. And I know, Karen, you mentioned, well, there's a lot more we may have to do in terms of accountability, and it's more time. But I guess then when you look at the resistance that's come up over time, and our ancestors and how they fought to get this right to vote over the years, between being beaten, between being tortured, between from being tortured to losing their lives, dying for the cause, and continue to even take their time to say, we need to fight for this. Yeah, Merlin and Karen, you're both saying, well, hey, there's a reason why people are fighting, so that you don't have it. But on our side, we've been fighting to have it.
Right.
And so even if it takes, a day, or even if it takes, the accountability piece of more than a day and extra time, it still sounds like it may be worth it. And at least to say, well, look, our ancestors got us this far, not just in voting on a number of fronts, but got us this far. And we should be willing to take some time out of our busy schedules, or even not so busy schedules in some cases, to take the baton the next step. So that makes sense to me. So what about for folks who say, and I think you've probably already answered this too to some extent, but I just want to bring it home a bit, in a sense that folks say, you know what, I'm not super big on politics generally. I'm not super big on altruism. I want to do some things that are going to put some dollars in my pocket. I want to hit these economics. I want finances coming my way. I want to be able to take care of my family, protect my family, and just keep it moving. I'm not trying to do all those big things. I just want these simple things to be done. And it's more an individualistic kind of perspective, but it's one that I think many people have nonetheless. And so what would you say, either one of you or both can take it, but what would you say to folks that say, look, at the end of the day, if I'm just really kind of in it for me, what's in it for me? And how can I just get what I want specifically, without saying I want to bring everybody on board and get everybody everything? I just want what I want.
So that's pretty funny. I think that's funny. I would say, if you want what you want, then you have to vote. If you want economic security for you, you've got to vote for it. I'm always amazed that you mentioned the tax code, right? You mentioned economic development. In all my days, and I was a staffer for a member who was on the finance committee, which controls the tax code, we almost never had Black and brown interests come. Yet the tax code makes you rich and it can make you poor. It can help you individually and it could help you collectively, right? But I never heard anyone come and say, the tax code is flawed. It has to work for families. It has to work for me and not just corporations. If we did, maybe it would work for that one person who says, look, I just want to get my piece of the pie. Everybody wants their piece of the pie, right? But when the system is sort of rigged so that some people get a piece of the pie who interact with their members of Congress, and those who don't, you're at the mercy, because we say in Washington, D.C., if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, meaning your interests are going in, right?
Right.
That's the way it is. So
Sense.
my argument is, go vote. If you're looking for your own self-interest, vote then too.
Yeah, I would just add that, every election is a choice. And, our interests may be aligned, they may not. But if my interest, if I know that one candidate's going to support my interests and the other one is not, that's what I'm going to vote for. If I don't vote for that person, then, the candidate who's not is not looking to support my interests, he may lose. And
Right.
so, if I don't vote, I'm contributing to him not losing, right? Or him not winning. So,
Right.
whoever you are, when there's a choice, either you're in it and you're going to increase the chances of your candidate or you getting policy that's helpful to you, or you sit it out, then you're stuck with whatever other people vote for and get. So,
Can I just say,
whether you're selfish or for the group, if you don't participate, you have very little chance of influencing the outcome.
yeah, Merlin, and if you should lose, your candidate loses, the candidate that wins that you didn't vote for, guess what? He represents you too.
That's right.
Go see him too and hold him accountable for what you want. Let him know that you'll be gunning for him when election comes if he's not doing right by your interest. So it's not the end of the day when your candidate loses.
Right.
It just starts it for the next 2 or 4 years, right? For you to get the candidate in or get them to do and come around to your way.
And listen, some candidates are reasonable people. So even though they didn't agree with your position, then you didn't support them through, communications. Maybe you can bring them to your side. Maybe you can convince them, listen, this is better for you and everybody else and all of us.
Right.
So, when I think of voting, I think of it as the minimal effort that people should take to make their lives better. It's not the end all. So, one vote is not going to change your life, but it hopefully will make things incrementally better, or at least give you a chance of making things better.
Yeah.
And we're going to start to wind down a bit, but if two questions. One, I'll give you each a chance to just kind of give your final thoughts. But before that, I'd like to say, if we agree that every African American should vote, then the question becomes, what can we do? Or what can people do generally to help that come about? Yes, this podcast will be one of those things. But beyond that, and those like them, and YouTube can do what it does. But what other things can people do to help that process move forward? And I put that out to either one of you.
Yeah. Making voting easier. In other countries, they've done electronic or mail-in voting for decades. Voting doesn't, there's a reason why they're trying to make it hard and curtail, mail-in ballots and other. It's not because of fraud, it's because that increases the electorate that's actually voting. And so I think we should really be working to make voting easier. But on a personal level, I mean, it's kind of like everyone I know, I kind of make sure, hey, you're going to the polls, or did you already vote, or did you get your absentee ballot? I think working with churches and your fraternities, I know I mentioned this, to make sure people vote, but also to make sure people know the issues. It's amazing. I think people know some issues, not all of the issues that really impact their self-interest and impact their well-being. And so encouraging people to learn and know the issues as well.
I think connecting the dots, right? So people kind of, think of voting and don't see tangible results of, that vote. But I think, we should encourage people want to do their own research and understand the different positions that the candidates are supporting, and then help people understand that it's a process. So, some people may think you vote and something's going to happen the next day. It's going to be an automatic change, an immediate change. That's not how it works. So I think, we can help educate people that it's a process. You find a candidate, you support the candidate, you hope they're elected. And if they are, you hold them accountable. But if they're not, you keep pushing to get, your views represented. And then, I think in the last couple of elections, we have some really tangible results that we can kind of try to use to connect the dots. So, you vote for this guy, they take rights away. You vote for that guy, he tries to restore rights, give you that advance, increase the rights you have. And it's important that people understand that it's a process and not an immediate return on that vote.
And I think to both of your points too, it sounds like there's also maybe there should be some big picture list of wins and losses. And so we won this, like you guys talked about earlier with the presidential elections. We won this because there was such great turnout, because African Americans showed up. We probably would have won this if more African Americans had showed up. But if someone could kind of break that down for us and help us see that and say, look, we're trying to fight for equal opportunity or whatever it is. And here are the folks that can help us do that. But we need you to come out to the polls, because your vote, as you see historically, this is how your vote counts and kind of translates into us getting that real change you can believe in, right? So that makes sense to me. Marlon and Karen, I'll give you guys an opportunity to kind of sum it up or say whatever final thoughts you have, and we'll wind it up that way. Marlon?
Karen, do you want to go or should I?
I will defer to you.
Okay. Yeah, look, I hope this is the first of a series of conversations about voting. And I think there are some really interesting examples we can point out to how decisions that were made in the last 8 years, 10 years, 16 years have really impacted the way our country has gone, the rights we received and the rights we lost. And I think those examples will make it easier and clearer of how important our actions are as we head into the next election.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback just to say so much change is going to happen through the ballot box. It's not the only way, but in conjunction with a lot of other, through economics, through judiciary, through other avenues in which we agitate to get opportunities that were denied. They occur through the ballot box. And I would really encourage, I'll see everyone at the polls. I think it is just that critical. We have died over centuries for the right to vote, and there's a reason for that. And there's a reason, as we said before, why it's so hard. But it's really incumbent upon us to honor our ancestors and vote. It is what makes democracy work. And so I'll see everyone at the polls.
Right. So Karen and Merlin, thank you so much for the insight throughout this session. I think you guys have done a fantastic job of making the case of why every African American should vote. As you mentioned, this is the first of our series on voting. We want to start by just talking about, why every African American should vote and to give some support to that. And I think you guys have both done a fantastic job of that here. So with this, we will close out the session and look forward to the next one.